On today's show, what is the actual solution to the NBA's tanking problem? What is the Nets' most likely draft position? What are the next steps in Sean Marks' rebuild plan? I'll answer all those fan questions and more on today's episode of Locked On Nets.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to Locked On Nets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now the number one sports podcast network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. This show is 100% free on all those great platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. And on today's episode, it's Fan Take Friday. I took questions and takes from Nets fans and listeners on a wide range of subjects. And we got a jam-packed mailbag this week. It's been a little bit since I've done a Fan Take Friday. We've had some Nets games on Thursday where I've been recording episodes for Friday. So getting into it, and this is actually going to be a two-parter because we have so many submissions. So in this episode, I'm going to be focusing on the NBA's tanking problem, also the Nets lottery position and how that could play out. And then in part two, I'll have some more stuff about the Nets rookies and the 2026 draft. But getting right into it, first question. Tanking has become the main talking point surrounding the NBA these last couple of weeks. I see a lot of people complaining, but what is the actual solution? What would you do to address the issue? That's from Tyler Moran. And yes, Nets fans obviously heard a lot about tanking, and tanking has become the main talking point surrounding the league as a whole as we head into the All-Star break, and for good reason. I mean, almost a third of the NBA is tanking before we're even at the All-Star break. It's ridiculous. It really is. And here's the aspect where I think a lot of people are getting it wrong. A lot of fans are getting it wrong. That's directing their anger at the teams. You should be directing your anger at the league because the NBA has built itself in a way that incentivizes losing. It's smart to tank. That's the bottom line. Like, it's not even really debatable at this point. We have decades worth of data proving this point that it's smart to tank, especially if you're a small market team. And the league finally took some steps yesterday to penalize some teams. They fined the Utah Jazz $500,000 for holding Lauri Markkanen and Jaren Jackson Jr. out in the fourth quarter of their last two games. They labeled that as conduct detrimental to the league. They also fined the Indiana Pacers $100,000 for violating the player participation policy, but it's not enough. You're going to need to go much further than that because if I'm a team like the Jazz or like the Pacers or any NBA team really, if I land as a result of tanking Darren Peterson or AJ DeVance or Cam Boozer, whoever else, I'll eat those fines all day long, man. It's not enough. And the way that the NBA needs to go about this is, as I said, they've incentivized losing. You need to flip that. You need to disincentivize losing. And to take it a step further, you need to incentivize winning because that's what the NBA is all about at the end of the day. I mean, I cover basketball for a living because I love basketball. I love watching it. If you're a fan and you're listening to this podcast and you follow my work, it's because you love basketball, you love the sport, you love watching people compete at the highest level. And what tanking is doing is it's going directly against everything that the NBA and sports in general should be about. So the NBA needs to flip it. They need to find a way to incentivize winning rather than losing for these teams that are at the bottom of the league. And look, that's not easy. I'm not going to act like it's an easy job that the NBA is undertaking because the whole point of the draft is to give bad teams a way to get better. And in particular, small market teams. Because to me, that's who the draft is really for most. It's for these small market teams that are not going to ever be on the trade request list or the free agent destinations list for these star teams. You look at it, the main way that they have to get better is through the draft and through drafting these types of guys. So that's who the draft is really for. And the NBA tried to take steps to address tanking by flattening the lottery odds. And it was really just a dumb solution. It was a dumb way to go about it because anybody, I think, could have looked at that and said, this isn't going to disincentivize tanking. These teams who are at the bottom of the league, these small market teams who, as I said, are never going to be on the trade request list for these big stars or get big guys through free agency, they're still going to tank. It's still their only recourse. And the only thing that flattening the lottery odds has done is it's made it so these small market teams are just stuck in this cycle of mediocrity, partly because some of them aren't run well, but also because they're falling in the draft and they're missing out on these top guys. Whether you talk about the Utah Jazz, the Washington Wizards, whatever other team you want to talk about, they're falling to the 5th, 6th, 7th picks. And meanwhile, teams like the Dallas Mavericks and the San Antonio Spurs are jumping up and getting these generational prospects. Philadelphia 76ers, same thing. So flattening the lottery odds has backfired, and it was actually a bad solution, in my opinion, or a bad way to go about it. So what is the solution? I'm going long. This might be most of the first segment, just this question, but it's something that I feel passionately about. The best solution that I've heard, the best solution that I've thought about is the NBA picking a point in the season where you flip it, where wins count towards the lottery standings rather than losses. So for a first portion of the season, it's as normal. Losses count towards the draft lottery standings, and then you hit a point and you flip it where every win you get counts towards your lottery record rather than losses. So, for example, to help you guys understand this, you look at the Nets record last season. Pre-All-Star break, they were 20-34. Post-All-Star break, they were 6-22. So their actual record is 26-56. But under the new revised system that I'm proposing, it would be 42-40, because post-All-Star break, your wins actually count towards the loss column and your losses actually count towards the win column. So that would be a way to incentivize winning during the second half of the season. I think that would really be the best way to go about it, in my opinion. And look, any of these proposals that you present are going to have, trade-offs. It's going to be an issue. Like, you look at it, you could say teams are still going to tank during the first half of the season. And sure, that's true. But still, teams usually in the beginning of the season, they want to not be tanking right out of the gate, because that is the time where you at least have some intrigue and some interest from fans surrounding your team. So you could still do that. You could still penalize tanking during the first half of the season, but at least you're going to have that second half of the season where teams are trying to win. And it could also be interesting because it would make some teams at the trade deadline who are out of it could become buyers at the deadline rather than sellers. Like, you look at the teams at this year's trade deadline, like the Jazz traded for Jaren Jackson Jr., the Wizards traded for Trae Young and Anthony Davis. Rather than trying to sit those guys and lose during the second half of the season, they'd be playing them and trying to win. So it could end up hurting, some teams who are actually the worst teams in the league, because during the second half of the season, you are going to have those teams who are still going to lose, and that's still going to hurt them. But at the end of the day, there's no perfect solution. And I think that this is the best one of the ones I've seen in order to incentivize winning rather than losing as the year goes on when tanking does get the worst. So that's what I'd say. And then the second thing that I would say is the NBA needs to come down harsher on these teams who are tanking, increase the amount that you're fining them, maybe get some, actual team building repercussions, whether it be future draft picks, cap space, whatever, for teams who are egregiously manipulating. And then also the mid-pick protections, you got to get rid of those, because you look at the teams year after year, these last few years, who are tanking the most egregiously. Like, you have the 76ers last season. This year, you have the Jazz, who owe their pick top 8 protected to OKC. You have the Wizards, who owe their pick top 8 protected to the New York Knicks. You have now the Pacers, who owe their pick top 4 protected to the Los Angeles Clippers. Just get rid of those. So my solution would be flipping it at some point during the season where wins count towards, the draft lottery standings rather than losses. Get rid of the mid-pick protections, and then come down harder on some of these teams that are tanking. But moving forward with this, getting more into some of the tank conversation, more particularly surrounding the Nets. Next question: based on remaining schedules / tanking, which teams do you think will finish top 5 in order from worst record? What is the Nets' most likely lottery position at the end of this season? That's from Mike NYY. And yeah, I'd say that I think the lottery picture is really starting to come into focus. You look at it, you have the Kings in 1, Wizards 2, Pelicans 3, Pacers 4, Nets 5, Jazz 6. And you look at the Nets position, the Nets are 4.5 games behind the Kings for the top spot, and the Kings are just actually god-awful. So I don't think the Nets are going to catch them. They're also 3.5 games ahead of the Mavericks, who are in 7th. So I don't think they're falling behind them. So I think that makes the Nets most likely range 2 to 6 when you look at it. I do think that they're going to find a way to stay ahead of the Jazz. I also think that they'll be able to pass the Pelicans, who are only a game and a half ahead of them and don't own their own pick. So they will be trying to win. So I'd say it's going to be the Nets, Wizards, and Pacers competing for the 2, 3, 4 spots. The Nets are currently tied with the Pacers in wins and 2 back in the loss column. They're 1 game behind the Wizards in the loss and the win column. So, as we've seen firsthand over the last week, as the Nets have seen firsthand, both of those teams, the Wizards and the Pacers, are going to be tanking very hard the rest of the way because, as I said, both owe their picks to other teams with protections. So it's going to be tough for the Nets to finish ahead of them. But I said it, on my episode after Wednesday's loss to the Pacers, the Nets have a really difficult upcoming schedule. 12 of their next 17 games are against winning teams. They have the 6th hardest remaining strength of schedule overall. Meanwhile, the Wizards are 12th, the Pacers are 18th, the Jazz are 21st, and the Pelicans are 22nd. So we'll see how seriously the Nets take tanking during the second half of the season. We'll see how, we'll see what lengths they actually are willing to go to in order to finish ahead of those teams. But I'd say the Nets' most likely position in the lottery standings is probably 2 through 4. And whether they're 2 or 4, that's going to come down to, how hard are they willing to tank to move ahead of some of these teams and also just stay ahead of teams like, or get ahead of teams like the Pelicans, stay ahead of a team like the Jazz so they're not in 5 or 6. So we'll see how that plays out. But that brings me to our next question. Do you think the Nets will aggressively sit more guys against other tanking teams like they did against the Pacers post-All-Star break? That's from SF Farouk. And yes, I do think. I think the Nets are going to be more aggressive about how they sit guys out. And I think we've already started to see them do that. Like they didn't sit guys out against the Wizards, which I thought was a curious decision, but maybe they thought they just couldn't lose that game. But I think that that's proven wrong by the fact that, they sit guys out against the Bulls, they end up winning. But then in this game against the Pacers, they sit out Michael Porter Jr., Nick Claxton isn't on the status report, and then he's downgraded to questionable and then out. And same thing with Noah Clowney, who's available, and then they end up ruling him out right before tip-off. They said he had an ankle issue before tip-off. It was causing him discomfort. How much do you play into that or read into that? That's up to you. But I do think they'll be more aggressive about it. And I would even go to take it a step further to say there might be a point where they shut down Michael Porter Jr. They weren't willing to do that last season with Cam Johnson and with some of these other guys. But I do think that they're going to be more serious about how they approach the tank. I think they've already shown that. They've been more aggressive in how they've gone about it this season compared to last. So I think there might be a point where they sit out MPJ. I think back-to-backs, they'll sit out guys for all of those, whether you talk about Yegor Dioman or, Drake Powell or whoever else. So I think they're going to be more aggressive about it. The thing I don't think they're going to do is actually like bench guys during games the way that, the Jazz have been doing. Like Jordi Fernandez just hasn't been willing to do that and to like actively try to throw games, which I think is correct. And I think that you shouldn't try to do that stuff. So I think they're going to be more aggressive about sitting guys out, potentially shut MPJ down, but we'll see. How they go about that is going to go a long way in determining where they land in the draft lottery standings and what their highest likelihood is of either moving up in the draft or falling. So we'll see. We got a lot more questions, some about the Nets rookies, also some about expansion. Which players would I protect if I was the Nets? Which players here are most likely to be long-term pieces? So I'll get into all that when I continue Locked On Nets after a quick break. Guys, tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax Full Service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms and work to get you every deduction. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. For a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If our TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. Coming back from the break, continuing today's Locked On Nets episode on this Fan Take Friday. Rolling on through all your remaining takes and questions. Next one. I hate tanking. The league needs to figure this out. That being said, the Nets rookies are developing to the point where you can't play Nolan and Yegor heavy minutes because they're impactful on winning. Crazy to say this about 19-year-old kids. The future is bright. That's from Ian Carucci. And yeah, I think I'd say that's fair. I mean, like you look at it these last few games and Yegor and Nolan have been overwhelming positives on the court. And like, they're just much better when those guys are on the court. And I think that part of that is in some of these tanking games, the bench is just so depleted, but also part of that is when the team is whole, like those guys are just being impactful. Like Yegor has been a net positive on the team altogether for most of the season, almost the whole season. And then you look at Nolan as of late, the offense has been much better when Nolan has been on the court. So those guys in particular, Yegor and Nolan, they've been kind of floor raisers for this Nets team overall. And those guys being in there if you're a Nets fan who's rooting for them to lose these games, although you're not going to be mad when Yegor or Nolan play well because they're rookies and development is a priority, when they're in there, I think you feel worse about their ability to be bad and not compete with these other teams. So that is a good sign. And I'd say overall, yeah, like those guys are going to play heavy minutes regardless. Like Nolan, Yegor, Drake, maybe they'll sit out some back-to-backs. Yegor, we know, is being managed on back-to-backs. Drake also, maybe Nolan joins that fray. But for the most part, those guys are going to play heavy minutes. And if they lead to some more wins than losses, so be it. Like, you can't be mad with that. Next question. With expansion being more realistic, which 8 players are you keeping safe on this team? To make it harder, let's pretend it's next season. We landed a top 3 pick and signed a free agent like Peyton Watson. That's from Ricky White. And I think for me, it's pretty straightforward for the most part, but the guys I'm definitely keeping, of the veterans, MPJ, Nick Claxton, Day'Ron Sharpe. I'll put Noah Clowney into that mix. I'm keeping all those guys. That's like not up for debate to me. And then beyond that, you get into the rookies, and that's where it gets interesting because I just named 4 guys. You have 5 rookie first-round picks. And at this point, I think it's kind of straightforward. I think a lot of Nets fans would also have this answer. Yegor Doman, Nolan Shore, Drake Powell. Guys are no-brainers. Those guys are staying. And then you're left with Danny Wolf and Ben Saraff. And based on the way those guys have performed, based on the way, based on the positional outlook you just look for the Nets, I'm keeping Danny Wolf. And I think Ben Saraff is going to be the odd man out. And that's not me saying that I don't think Ben Saraff just doesn't have hope in the NBA, but I think that I'm not keeping him over any of those other Nets rookies. And then you look at the Nets veterans, I'd say the last 2 guys are probably Day'Ron Sharpe. If we're not bringing contracts into the equation, like Day'Ron Sharpe and Noah Clowney, and I'm not keeping Ben Saraff over either of those guys. So those are the 8 guys that I would say. Next question. How many guys on our roster will be on our 2028 team if the Nets land the number 1 pick in the 2026 draft? Jaren Jackson Jr. was a Utah Jazz pre-tank move. Same with Anthony Davis and Trae Young on the Wizards. Celtics and Pacers set up nicely for next season with returning superstars from injury. Should Brooklyn embrace this model? That's from Big Bononos. I'm a little confused by the question, but overall, I guess you're asking, who's going to be on the Nets long-term and which players, do you think that they would try to bring in some star level guys to expedite their timeline like some of those other tanking teams have done? And if you're looking at the Nets that I think are going to be long-term pieces on this team right now, I think you're looking at a lot of the guys I just named, definitely guys that could be are Michael Porter Jr., Nick Claxton, Day'Ron Sharpe, Noah Clowney. And then of the rookies, I'd say for sure, I think, Yegor and Nolan are probably going to be. Drake, I think there's a good chance. And then Danny Wolf and Ben Saraff, I think those guys are very much up in the air. But I would say overall that, if you're asking about should the Nets try to prioritize some star acquisitions to expedite their timeline the way some of those other teams have done, I would say if it's a guy who fits the timeline, and if it's a guy who can really help them get to that next step without mortgaging some of the long-term outlook that they have for short-term gains. So would I have done some of those moves that those other teams did? Like you look at the Trae Young, you look at the Anthony Davis move, you look at the Jaren Jackson Jr. move. Jaren Jackson Jr. is probably the guy I would consider the most because he's the youngest of that group. I wouldn't have been interested in the Trae Young move. I definitely would have been interested in the Anthony Davis move, but I think that the Nets will look in those waters of the kind of buy low candidates, some guys that they could bring in and who could be the bridge guy into their next iteration. But the main thing that I would hammer down on is don't give up, long-term assets and long-term team building capital in order for short-term gains just because you owe your pick to the Houston Rockets next season and you don't want to be bad. Continue building through the draft, continue building through youth, stay on this timeline. And if you're going to expedite it, it's got to be, for one, a guy who is, wholeheartedly going to change the outlook of your franchise and give you a real shot at contending in the near future. As Sean Mark said, when I asked him about it at last year's exit interviews, he said, if you're trading for a star guy, it has to be a guy that unequivocally transforms the outlook of your franchise overnight. And that brings us to the next question. Is there more potential for Brooklyn to go after Giannis in the summer now that he wasn't traded at the deadline, nor was MPJ or Clax or Day'Ron? A top pick, MPJ, Giannis, Yegor, Nolan, and Day'Ron or Claxton would be fun. That's from Dan Leahy. And I'd say that, is there more potential for the Nets to go after Giannis because he wasn't traded at the deadline? I'd say yes, in the sense that they weren't getting him at the deadline. That just wasn't going to happen. Now that it's gone to the summer, and it's probably going to drag out until after the lottery where you see what position teams get in, all the teams know what picks they have, including the Nets. I wouldn't close the door on it. Do I think that it's an advisable route that I think they should go? I don't. And I'm probably going to do a whole episode on this, maybe with Brian Lewis in the next week, who has had a lot of reporting surrounding the Nets' interest in Giannis. But if you look at it, if the Nets say they get the number one pick and they get a guy like Darren Peterson, and you can form a starting five where you can have, MPJ, you can have Darren Peterson, Yegor, MPJ, Giannis, and then one of Claxton or Day'Ron. Is that all that realistic? Would you be able to get Giannis without giving up those pieces, any of those pieces? I can't say for sure, but I will say the Nets would have other prospects left over. You could probably trade Claxton as the main salary filler. They have a boatload of first-round picks, and if you could put together a starting five, Darren Peterson, Yegor, MPJ, Giannis, Day'Ron, would I do it? I don't know, but especially if it means giving up like almost all of your other assets or a huge chunk of them. I don't know, but I definitely consider it. I definitely don't think that you can say that that's like a route that Nets shouldn't explore whatsoever. So because it dragged out into the offseason, I would say there is more potential. Do I think it's likely? No, because I think that it also have to be Giannis would have to signal that he wants to be in Brooklyn and he wants to be comfortable. He's going to be comfortable extending with Brooklyn, and he hasn't given any indication of that thus far. But we do know that he has interest in the New York market. If the Nets get a top guy like Darren Peterson, we'll see. You definitely can't rule it out given the Nets' previous interest. Next question before a break. Why does it matter how high a draft pick we get when the general manager is building with a flawed basketball philosophy? This team is soft. Even though we have decent young talent, sustainable perpetual success will never be maintained by such a weak team. That's from D-Rock. And I get what you're saying. I definitely think that there's been a criticism of the Nets that they don't go after enough forceful players. They go after a lot of finesse guys, and that has been the case in the past. I'd say with the team right now, the Nets are pretty much building this from scratch. You have the guys that they've taken in the draft, and if you're going to say that they're soft, you look at the guys that they drafted, the guys that are at the top who they invested their most serious picks in, Yegor, Nolan, and Drake Powell. If you want to say that they're soft, sure, I don't really necessarily agree with that, but I understand where you could be coming from the sense that Yegor's a finesse guy. He obviously doesn't go to the basket. He's not that used to playing with physicality. Nolan's a little bit more of a slighter guy. Drake Powell, I don't think you can say that really as much about him. But despite that, I don't think anybody is mad right now at the Yegor or Nolan picks. So saying that those guys are soft or saying that those guys, aren't going to be guys who you can win with long-term because they're more finesse guys, I don't agree with that. If you're talking about the Nets not having necessarily enough beef in the middle, maybe going with a guy like Nick Claxton, who hasn't been a good rebounder throughout his career, or Noah Clowney, I think there's legitimate gripes there, but I'd say that the Nets are building this from scratch, and I don't think that you could be mad with some of the young talent that they brought in, and then they're going to have a ton of flexibility to build this forward in whatever vision they see fit. Now, if Sean Marks builds forward and continues to only invest in finesse guy, this team doesn't get more forceful, more athletic, more physical, then yes, I think that you would have a legitimate gripe there. We got a few more questions. One about Cam Thomas, his performance for the Bucks during that win over the Magic. Also, some Day'Ron Sharpe, Nick Claxton stuff. And then also just questions about the Nets situation overall. How are they going to build forward? So we'll get into all that when I continue Locked On Nets after a quick break. Finding a doctor you actually like can feel like discovering a diamond in the rough. Sure, you want someone who's in network nearby and has availability, but you also want a doctor who listens, makes you feel comfortable, and explains things clearly. That kind of doctor exists, and finding them is easy with ZocDoc. ZocDoc is the free app and website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors so you can find someone you love without all the hassle. We're talking about booking in-network appointments with more than 150,000 providers across all 50 states, covering over 200 specialties from primary care and dentistry to dermatology and eye care. Guys, I'll admit it, I've definitely put off making doctor's appointments longer than I should. Between work, life, and everything else, it's easy to delay. ZocDoc makes the process simple. You can search by specialty or symptoms and actually build a care team that works for you. You can see real-time availability and book instantly. No phone calls, no waiting on hold. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNBA to find and instantly book the doctor you love today. That's ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNBA. ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNBA. Thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring this message. The new year is here, and it's the perfect time to reset your routine and refresh your space. If you're spending more time at home, you might as well love how it looks and feels. That's why you should go to Wayfair. It's a one-stop shop for getting your home back on track. From bedding and mattresses to storage solutions for every room, Wayfair makes it easier from start to finish. Wayfair has everything you need for a full home refresh all in one place. Whether you're updating your living room, organizing your space, or upgrading your work from home setup, Wayfair's huge selection makes it easy to find exactly what works for your style and budget. Guys, I picked up new bedding and accent pillows from Wayfair, and it completely changed how my bedroom feels. It's cleaner, calmer, and more put together. I love that I could find pieces that match my style without spending a fortune. Shopping is easy, delivery is smooth, and everything arrives exactly as expected. Get organized, refreshed, and back on track this new year for way less. Head to wayfair.com right now to shop all things home. That's WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair. Every style, every home. Coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode on this Fan Take Friday. Rolling on through all your remaining takes and questions. Next one. Cam Thomas is going to make Sean Marks look foolish for waiving him. CT dropped 34 points on 60% shooting in his second game as a Buck. Very disappointed with how Marks handled this situation. That's from Ethan Gans. And look, this was the most predictable thing ever. After the Nets waived Cam Thomas, he was going to have a big scoring game. That was inevitable. And when you knew that there were going to be a lot of Nets fans who freaked out about it, there were going to be a lot of people just in the NBA Twitterverse and NBA, discourse as a whole who try to clown the Nets and say that they made a big mistake. Look, I understand it. Like Cam Thomas, it's tough to see a guy who just waived go and score 34 points off the bench on 60% shooting and win a game for another team, especially with the Nets in a taking situation right now. But I'd also say we know Cam Thomas can score. Like, Nets fans should act like they've been there before. We've seen Cam Thomas have big scoring games. Is it at all surprising to me that he was able to score 34 points on 60% shooting and he was able to have a really, tough shot-making game? No. Why would that be surprising to me? We've seen him do it before. Have we seen games where Cam Thomas has gotten hot and he's had it going and he scored a lot on a lot of really tough shots and long contested jumpers? Yes, we've seen that before. What we haven't seen him do is buy into playing a team-oriented style of basketball and playing a defensive style of basketball, being a willing facilitator, not being on the ball a ton, be efficient, highly efficient over a long extended period of time on the shot diet that he's taken. We haven't seen that. We still haven't seen that in one game where Cam Thomas scores 34 points on 60% shooting isn't changing that. So I understand why it could be frustrating to some fans, but if you watch Cam Thomas, you're going to have to see him for an extended period, play some defense, be a better passer, be able to impact the game when he's not dominating the ball, when he doesn't have it going from a tough shot-making perspective. Because if you watch the highlights from his performance against the Magic, he got to the basket a little bit more, but it was a lot of really long, contested, tough jumpers. He's going to make those sometimes, and it looks really good when he does. But he doesn't make them enough to warrant some of the other shortcomings that he has, to warrant building your offense around him. So that's something that we've seen. Now, if Cam Thomas moves forward and he changes some of those other things, then yeah, that could make Sean Marks look foolish. But I think you need to see him actually do that, which we haven't yet, before you can make some of those judgments. So I disagree with you. I understand you being disappointed, but I don't think that the Nets are really going to look that foolish for waiving Cam Thomas, just given the fact also that he hadn't bought into doing things that the Nets wanted him to do while he was here. So that's on Cam Thomas just as much as it is the Nets. So that's what I'd say about that. Next question. No one's asked, but long-term, who you got, Day'Ron or Clax? That's from Jiffy Leaks. And I'd say that I've talked about this before, and I'd say that if you're factoring in the contract situation, which I think you have to, given the way that you asked the question, I would say Day'Ron Sharpe. I'd be more comfortable with the Nets moving forward with Day'Ron Sharpe on a contract that's in if you can get him on a 40-year deal in the 40 to 60 million range, $10 to $15 million annually, I would feel much better about Day'Ron Sharpe with some of the strengths that he showed with him being younger, with some of the ways that he's able to impact the game that Clax isn't as a rebounder in some of those areas, and the way that he's been, I think, close to Clax in some of these other areas, the defensive improvement he showed, the things that he's been able to flash as a passer, the finishing getting better, all that. I would feel better with moving forward with Day'Ron on a discounted rate and then cashing in and getting whatever you can for Claxton, as opposed to, keeping both of them or keeping Clax over him, who's going to be making more money moving forward. So that's what I'd say about that. Next question. Hi, Eric. Bit of a philosophical question here. First of all, for you, what is the real deeper meaning and pleasure of being a sports fan? Then, how is this season either fulfilling or not fulfilling that deeper purpose? I'm wondering if this season is not counterintuitively perfect. That's from Other Birds. Interesting question. I'd say for me, as a sports fan, the deeper meaning and pleasure of being a sports fan is it being an escape, first of all. Like, it's an escape from obviously some of the other things that are happening in the world that are important, but I think you can't necessarily focus on all the time because you're going to get, burnt out and beaten down if you just always focus on that stuff. So it's an escape. I'd say also fandom, I feel like, is a sense of community. Like, when you're a fan of a team and you're rooting alongside a large group of other people and you all have a common goal in mind, you can kind of all buy into that, be fully invested on that, bond over that. I think that there's a sense of community that I think is really beautiful about sports. And I think that really comes hand in hand with being a sports fan. And I think that that's the biggest part of it. For me, I'd also say, personally, I'm a reporter now at this point. Like, sure, I'm still a sports fan, but I've heard this from a lot of reporters when I got into the job that once you become a reporter and once covering sports becomes your life, your fandom, I think, starts to wane a little bit. And I do think that that's true. Like, sure, I'm still a basketball fan. I still love basketball. I'm still a football fan. I still love football. But this is my job now. So it's kind of changed for me. But now I think the biggest, purpose for me is watching guys compete at the highest level, watching guys push themselves to their limit and try to be the best. And then also, covering that, outlining the stories surrounding that, evaluating the process surrounding that, and relaying that to fans. So that is the purpose for me now. This season, I think it's been tough with the tanking stuff because I think that the tanking stuff, as I touched on with the first question of this FTF, has been kind of counterintuitive and gone against kind of all of what some of that is about. But I think the Nets have done a good job of towing the line. So overall, I think that, a lot of those principles and a lot of those reasons that I got into that have stayed true to me this season. And it has been a lot of fun. Last couple of questions closing this out. Why is Josh Minot not playing? That's from Steve Sizzling Takes. And yes, Josh Minot has not played yet. He's been on the Nets team for three games now following the trade deadline. Ochai Agbaji, the other trade acquisition, made his debut during the Nets' loss to the Pacers. I'd say that the Nets still have some other guys that they're trying to get minutes for. Like Jalen Wilson has been a guy who's been on the Nets bench. He's done a lot of the things that they've asked of him. I think that they want to give him a fair shot. He's been a guy who's been playing in the second unit rather than Minot. But I do think that as the season progresses, we're going to get a look at Minot, and I would expect that fairly soon. But that's all the questions I got for you guys on this part 1 of this Fan Take Friday. Make sure to tune into part 2 coming on Saturday. So make sure to tune into that when I'm back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.